Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us for what promises to be a really wonderful discussion about this rapidly growing field of rights of nature. My name is Michelle Maloney, and I'm the co-founder and national convener of the Australian Earth Laws Alliance, or AILA, and it's really lovely to see you all joining us today to have a listen to our wonderful guest speaker, Erin O'Donnell. Before I introduce Erin, I just wanted to set the context with a little reminder about what rights of nature looks like globally and where things are actually going. So please bear with me while I press a few buttons. So first, oops, I'd like to acknowledge country before my slides run away with themselves. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm lucky enough to live, work and play in the beautiful lands of the Yarra River peoples. I'd like to acknowledge the elders past and present, the emerging leaders and young people, and the remarkable civilizational culture that has cared for country and cared for each other since time immemorial. For those who don't know, the work we do inside AILA and our sister organisation Future Dreaming is really excited and committed to working in solidarity with Indigenous and First Nations peoples and friends. And the work we do looks at a whole range of issues from an Indigenous people's first law perspective. And we're also personally committed, myself as a non-Indigenous person, to understanding how to decolonise the way we think about our lives, our role as human beings, and perhaps most importantly, how we see country and how we relate to nature. So as is becoming a Zoom tradition, I invite you all to pop into the chat where you are, whose country you're on, say hello, let us know what you're up to and what you're thinking today. Oh, and that is a photo of the beautiful water lilies in a remnant waterhole near where I used to live. And I just think it's a beautiful photo to connect us, even virtually, to the joys and loveliness of nature. So the Australian Earth Laws Alliance has been engaged in conversations about the rights of nature since the very early days of its emergence. I was honoured to be part of a group of people in Ecuador after the Cochabamba gathering in Bolivia. A whole bunch of us got together in 2013, 2014 in Ecuador, and we're talking about rights of nature at that point. After having created AILA back in 2012. And when AILA first started, and I know Erin won't mind me just having a little trip down nostalgia lane, when AILA was born and we would talk about rights of nature, it was very much seen as a South American thing. You had the 2008 Constitution that embraced rights of nature in Ecuador. You had a 2010 Act in Bolivia that didn't get a lot of traction or implementation, and that was it. And then in 2017, a whole bunch of things started to change, and a lot of it has to do with rivers, which I'm really looking forward to Erin's update today. But for those who are completely new to rights of nature, the one thing I want to remind folks who might not be familiar is that the very early days of the rights of nature movement actually started in the US in a jurisdictional approach, meaning local communities were declaring that they had the right to protect nature and that nature had a right to exist inside their, it might have been a local borough or a local town council area. And then we had the Ecuadorian constitution saying that the rights of nature are recognised in the whole country. And over time, that has successively produced dozens of cases, a very recent one just this week, recognising the rights of a whole bunch of different ecosystems and species in Ecuador. Since then, though, the ecosystem approach has become much more predominant, and I know Erin will talk a lot more about that, with New Zealand and rivers being recognised in lots of various ways and in lots of different ways. But what's also interesting is that through, for example, in the US, First Nations peoples in their own tribal legal system, recognising the rights, for example, of a species of wild rice, which in turn has given them a capacity to speak up and challenge unwanted developments like fossil fuel, gas pipes, a whole bunch of projects that threaten the rights of their very important rice in their communities. So that's actually all I wanted to say, is just to remind folks who are new to the rights of nature that the rights of a river or the legal personhood, which a lot of folks talk about, aren't the only ways that this movement, these legal ideas are spreading. Excuse me. And here in Australia, There's a whole bunch of different groups exploring different ways. And I'm really excited that here in Australia, with a colonial legacy legal system, there's a whole bunch of challenges that we have to address together. And that's the work that Ayla does and that we're really excited about. And it's woven into the bigger picture of Earth jurisprudence. And if you want to get in touch with Ayla about some of the work we do to support communities exploring these new ideas, please get in touch anytime. So that's our little connectivity to the bigger movement. And I'm still on the advisory council for the Global Alliance for the Rights of Nature, and watching their incredible work. It's really escalating. It's terrific. But that's enough from me. I'm delighted to now hand over to Erin O'Donnell. I might let you introduce your work and affiliations, Erin. I think it's nicer to introduce your own aspects of work as you feel are important and relevant to your chat. So Erin's going to talk with us for about 30 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. If you have any questions at any time, please write them in the chat. I'll be collating them, and then we'll have our chat at the end. So thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much, Mish, and please do interrupt me if we're getting to about 1:45 and I haven't stopped talking. I will try and make sure that happens. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm really thrilled to be here with so many of you. This is really exciting. I am a researcher at the University of Melbourne Law School. I'm also a member of the Birrarung Council, and we are the voice of the Birrarung. The Birrarung is the river that you can see behind me. It's the Yarra River that flows through the heart of Melbourne. I would like to begin by paying my respects to Wurundjeri people. So I'm coming to you from their lands today. Along with Birrarung people, they are the people of the river. And it is in large part due to a lot of their advocacy that the Birrarung legislation exists today, and that we even have a Birrarung Council. So I'm going to be talking a little bit more about that as we get into the conversation today. I've been working on the rights of rivers particularly for about 5 or 6 years now. I did my PhD on what happens when we construct the environment as a legal subject. So what happens when we give it rights and powers of its own? The really exciting space for me in this is because, as Michelle just mentioned, a lot of the rapid movement in the rights of nature space is occurring around rivers. There is something about the river as an entity that seems to resonate with people around the world, and that seems to inspire us to do things to protect those rivers, regardless of the health of those rivers. So this is not a movement which is designed to go out and protect places which are in extraordinary levels of health. This is about places that are special, that we have relationships with. And that's the driving factor. Rivers around the world, almost every river that has received this kind of legal status, either as a living entity or as a legal subject, and I'll talk more about that in a second, these rivers are highly impacted, all of them, but they are beloved by their communities. So that, I think, is kind of an inspiring place to begin, because it means that no matter how sick the river that we love is, we can all start taking steps to make it healthier, to bring ourselves into good relations with that river. So I'm going to start now sharing my slides, wherever they are, there they are, and moving through this presentation. There we go. Okay, so yeah, that's another lovely photo of the Birrarung. This is looking upstream the Birrarung. You can see some boats down there of different people enjoying it. Most of those are electric boats, and there's obviously one that's not electric. You can see the MCG in the background. This is the heart of central CBD Melbourne, and the river flows through that. And again, reminds us that we are connected with this entity, this living being that flows from the mountains to the sea. And I'll talk about some of the services that this particular river still provides Melbourne today. But I'm going to begin with this question, really, of what law can do to bring us back into good relations with rivers. And I'm going to start here with Western water law. So Western water law is the law that particularly Australia inherited from the UK. This is a law that constructs water as a resource awaiting capture and exploitation. And that particular quote comes from the work of John Page and Alessandro Palazon. So water is a resource. To water law, water is therefore only visible and understandable, legible to the law as an object over which humans have dominion. That's the starting point for water law in Australia. So already we can start to see from Michelle's presentation before that recognising rivers or nature as living or legal entities really challenges that assumption. It says water is far more than just a resource. So even before we do anything else, that symbolism of what rights of nature stand for, what they ask us to reconsider and rethink, and what they do in terms of what law must do, reconsider and rethink its relation to water, is profound. So the question that I'm beginning with today is, can law actually operate as a mechanism of repair to undo the harm of these Western water laws that still persist and operate in countries like Australia today, and actually bring us back into good relations with water? And I'm saying back there in brackets for a couple of reasons. In the Australian context, I don't think non-Indigenous peoples have ever had a good relation with water. The laws that we brought to this country and the manner with which we brought those laws erased the existing laws and connections between countries, or at least obscured. They didn't take them away, but we certainly pretended that they didn't exist. But before the British came to Australia, all of us were Indigenous to somewhere. This is a quote from Uncle Dave Wandin, a Wurundjeri elder. So all of us come from communities that were once in good relations with rivers. Here in the Australian context, traditional owners maintain that good relationship. And so what can we learn? How can we learn from their laws to bring us back into good relations in this country with these rivers? Again, I'm not going to spend too much time on this slide because I think Michelle's really painted this picture for you very beautifully. But rights of nature have been on an accelerating trajectory over almost 2 decades now. So this is a really exciting space. I think I kept waiting for it to slow down. I kept thinking, like, at some point people are going to ease back on this, but no, it's a really exciting idea. It's a big idea, and it's being taken up by legislatures, by judges, by community advocates, by local governments all around the world. And it is continuing to accelerate, and it's genuinely exciting. And you can see the ones in bold there relate to rivers and waterways. So again, they are a profound driver of change. And I want to note that this is not in any way an exhaustive list either. This is just the ones that I could come up with that fit on a page. So if you want to see more about where rights of nature is actually happening and the global reach of it, I definitely recommend having a look at the Eco Jurisprudence Monitor website. So when we think about the rights of nature, and particularly the rights of rivers, we need to understand that there are multiple ways that they are recognised in law. And these multiple ways of recognising rivers create differences in their rights, powers, duties, and the way that the law sees them. So if we start at the top there with the legal person and the subject of rights, legally, these two ideas are quite similar, but they tend to emerge in quite different jurisdictions. So Australia, for instance, is what's called a common law country. So we tend to use the phrase legal person. And that's typically like a corporation, right? It's a bit of a legal fiction. It's a way of saying this is an entity that is capable of bearing rights and duties. And the legal person is assumed to bring with it a certain bundle of rights. So typically that will include the right to go to court. You can sue, you can be sued. You can enter into and enforce contracts. You can own property. So these are the indicators of legal personhood in places like Australia. The subject of rights, the legal subject, is very similar, but it tends to happen in civil law jurisdictions. And I can explain the difference to you a bit later if you're interested, but what matters is that the subject of rights is not assumed to bring with it any particular rights. So it's an entity capable of bearing rights and duties, but the courts or the legislature will need to articulate what those specific rights and duties actually are. So if we look around the world, a really good example of this would be the Rio Atrato in Colombia. And that's a river that the Constitutional Court recognized as having specific rights. It was an entidad sujeto de derecho, which is, in my very bad Spanish, is an entity that capable of being a legal subject, of bearing rights. And it had the specific rights of conservation and protection. It did not include the right to own property, for instance. So there was a limited set of rights, only what the Constitutional Court actually articulated. Coming down a bit, we see the living person. This is a really interesting one because we're only seeing it so far in Indian jurisdictions. The living person is a tricky one for law because the only living person that the law understands right now is the human being. So when a river is recognized as a living person, which was the case for the Ganga and Yamuna rivers in India, it was both legally creative, but also potentially confusing. So It was creative in the sense that it gave advocates the possible argument to say, well, the Yamuna River is now too polluted to be considered alive. If the law sees it as a living person, it is now dead and someone killed it. So there is a police record on file for the homicide of the Yamuna River because it is a living person. But it does start to blur the boundaries a bit. So does a river as a living person then, does it have the right to be protected against criminal activity? Can it commit crimes itself? Does it start to have human rights attached to it because it is a living person? So these are the questions that start to flow out of that classification. Last, at the bottom of this list here, we have the living being or the living entity. This is not a legally powerful way of describing a river in law. It is a legal recognition that the river is in its entirety a living entity. That is significant. Again, if we put it into the context of the way that water law sees rivers as an object or a resource for exploitation, becoming a living entity is a profound challenge to that. But it doesn't do anything more. It doesn't bring the right to go to court. It doesn't bring the right to own property. It's not a legal person. So it is a legally weak construction of a river. But it's powerful in the way that it asks us to transform our understanding and our relationship with the river. So the critical thing to take away from these multiple ways of constructing rivers in law is to think about the problem that you are trying to solve. Rights of nature has emerged in lots of different jurisdictions, in lots of different ways, and in response to many different drivers. Some people are seeking to level the playing field, to enable the environment to fight back in court in particular against the interests of developers. If you need to do that, then you need to look at a legally powerful form of the environment like the legal person. In other instances, it's much more about saying we need to change the relationship, because the relationship is what actually sets the boundaries for governmental decision-making, for instance. So Gerard Elbert, the lead negotiator for Wanganui Iwi on the Wanganui legislation that came out in 2017, he talks about having a generational change in mind. And so he's looking at the future reconsenting of the hydropower on the Wanganui River and saying, in 20 years' time, when that decision is up for grabs again, we need to have a completely different relationship between the entire community and the river. And the way we get there is to recognise the river as a living and indivisible entity. So the Wanganui is also a legal person. That's probably the other thing to bear in mind with this, is that you can use these ideas often in combination. So you can be a legal person as well as a living being. And they both tend to lead to slightly different outcomes. The other thing to take away from the global experience of rivers as they have gained these new legal statuses is that not a single river around the world has received rights to water in addition to its legal rights. So when we look around the world, it's either not included, like the Rio Watrato, it doesn't have any property rights, so it doesn't own any of those water rights. It's excluded explicitly in the case of the Wanganui River. The legislation specifically says it does not affect any existing rights to water, and the river does not receive any of those rights to water. And again, if you look all the way around the world, and I've just put a few examples up here, there is a disconnect still between the legal recognition of the river and what it's actually gaining in water rights. Now, water rights are not the only thing that matters. So when we again look around at water management, are we starting to see shifts in that space? This is a little bit more positive. We can start to see in the case of the Rio Watrato, in the case of the Wanganui River, that there are elements of their new institutional arrangements that will speak to the way that water and waterways are managed and start giving the river the power to start to embed itself in the ways that waterways are managed. So if we look down the bottom here at the Birrarung, so far there's a minimal role, but I'm going to talk a bit more about that because the Birrarung Council has an extraordinarily important integrity function to perform in this space. So I'll come back to that. But again, you can see there's still this disconnect in many, many cases between the way that law regulates and manages water and waterways and the way that it recognises the rivers as living entities. So we need to bridge that gap. We need to bring these two different areas of law much more into conversation with one another if we're genuinely going to change outcomes for rivers. So getting back to the idea of law as a mode of repair. This is, I think, a really interesting point to spend some time with, because the first question we need to ask ourselves, of course, is what has gone wrong? What is broken that needs repairing? And there are multiple answers to that question. So in the Australian context, one of the defining features of our relationship with water is aqua nullius. Aqua nullius was the assumption that the British made when they arrived, that the water belonged to no one like the land, and that they could therefore take it. This continues to undermine the relationship of all settler state people in Australia with rivers and waterways, as well as obviously profoundly affecting the rights and interests of traditional owners across Australia. So we're starting to think about what is broken here. What do we need to bring ourselves back into relations with the river? We see this urgency in the context of the Anthropocene. We are experiencing challenges through the climate catastrophe that certainly non-Indigenous people have not experienced before. So we're starting to reach for new ways of thinking about environmental protection, and rights of nature are playing a role in that. We see climate change as a driver in places like Bangladesh, in places like India. They're recognizing that this requires radical new tools to respond to. But we're also seeing that resistance, and that resistance is largely embodied in that disconnect between water law and the recognition of rivers as rights holders. The remade river can, of course, take many forms, and we've talked about that already. So the different ways that the law can construct a river as a rights holder or as a living entity provides different opportunities to repair those relationships or to not repair them. So if you are looking at a legally powerful form of the environment, if you think that what is broken is the inability of the river to fight back, then making that river a legal subject can directly address that potential flaw or that broken piece of law. But in doing so, it also reinscribes this very adversarial relationship. It says that we are competitors with the river. The river now has to fight for its own share of water, of protection. It has to fight back against developers. And what you end up with is entrenching humans and the rivers in this adversarial relationship. Now, sometimes that's where we are already. And sometimes we need to reach for the legal tool that we can to try and fight our way out of that. But it's important to consider what we are remaking. What relationship are we rebuilding when we make the river in law into a legally powerful entity? On the flip side, the living entity in law is legally weak, so it's not going to repair that ability of the river to fight back and to protect its own interests. But it can usher in this ethic of relationality and care. Recognizing rivers as a living entity invites all of us into a relationship with that river. It says we don't have to emphasize the transactional, exploitative nature of water law. We can start to understand ourselves as being in a reciprocal relationship, an interdependent relationship with that river. And we all have relations with rivers. Every single one of us here on this call today, you will all have walked along a river or visited a river, sometime in the not too distant past. And I'd like just to pause for a second and encourage you to remember that moment and think about what it felt like when you were there with the river. Which river were you visiting? What were you doing while you were there? What did it sound like? Could you touch the water? Sometimes we can't. So I spend a lot of time on the Birrarung, but in its lower reaches, it's not really safe, sadly, to go into that water. So we all have these relationships. If you're in Melbourne, you have an extremely intimate relationship with the Birrarung because it still supplies about 70% of Melbourne's drinking water. So every time you turn on a tap, you are depending on the health of that river and you're in a relationship with that river. So recognizing it as a living being asks us to think about what kind of relationship we actually want to create. And instead of emphasizing power and competition and fear, it emphasizes reciprocity. And that's a really profound shift. So to move from that broad conversation, I'm now going to step into a little bit more of a detailed discussion of the leading Australian example in settler state law, which is, of course, the Birrarung. The title of the legislation is in Birrarung, and it means keep the Birrarung alive. Willipjin Birrarung Moron. This is Victoria's first piece of bilingual legislation. It is Australia's first piece of settler state legislation that recognises the river as a living entity. And it came about from a number of different perspectives. Firstly, for the traditional owners, the people of the river, Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung, for them, the river has always been a living being. And you can see this in the preamble of the legislation if you go and have a look at it. They have always had this relationship. They have always known the Birrarung. So for them, the river has always been a living being. And that's a big driver for why we have ended up where we are today. The trigger for the state to get involved was actually a trip up the river. So the Yarra River keeper took the then opposition member, who was the shadow planning minister. I'm sorry, I can't even remember the MP's name, but this is back in 2013. They took this guy up the river on their boat and said, when you see the river holistically from the river's perspective, can't we all agree that actually we need some legislation in place that manages the river holistically from the river's perspective? They were extremely successful with that argument because the government, that was a Labor MP, they won government in 2014. This particular individual moved on to other things. So we had a new incoming planning minister, but the commitment from the party was so strong that this was one of their major planks and major platforms for that election. And then they immediately set about appointing a ministerial advisory committee to develop this new legislation. So that trip up the river from the Yarra River keeper was foundational. So we've got a new government, we've got a ministerial advisory committee trying to advise them on what that legislation would look like. It unfortunately took them about 6 months before they thought maybe we should include the traditional owners. Perhaps they'd like to have a say on that ministerial advisory committee. So that was a very unfortunate oversight. Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung were invited onto that committee eventually, and it was because of their leadership on that committee that we now have the river recognised as a living entity, because the committee would not necessarily have come up with that on their own. The other really important part of this was that whilst this ministerial advisory committee was undertaking its work, and once they'd produced their report back to government and government was developing its own policy response to drive this legislation, there was another community process which was running simultaneously, being led by organisations like Environment Justice Australia. And so they, along with the Yarra River keeper and other community groups, were forming a kind of alternative perspective on what the legislation should do. You can see some of the commonalities between the vision that they were creating and what's ended up in the legislation. But of course, they didn't get everything they asked for. But what they did do was provide a really important push for government. Do a little bit more, go a little bit further, because this is what the community is telling you that they want and what they can see for the Birrarung. So it was a combination of a whole lot of different drivers coming together and a whole lot of different parts of the community coming together to recognise the river as a single living integrated natural entity. It is Australia's first and so far only river that is a living entity. This is a photo from the floor of Parliament at the second reading speech for this legislation. Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung elders were invited to speak for the very first time on the floor of Parliament, and they spoke in Woi-wurrung. This was another first for Victoria, and it was a really profound moment, and it really shone an enormous spotlight on the relationship between Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung and the river. One of the key outcomes of that legislation was, of course, the Birrarung Council. We're a voice for the Birrarung. There can be a maximum of 12 members, at least 2 of whom must be Wurundjeri Woi-wurrung elders. So we currently have 3 elders. There's recently been a ruling on the boundaries between Wurundjeri and Birrarung. So the Birrarung Council will be joined by a Birrarung elder shortly as well. So there'll be 4 traditional owner members on the Birrarung Council. And we have both an advice and an advocacy role. We must advise the Minister for Water. We must advocate for the interests of the river. So we must speak for the river, but also with the river. So it's part of our role to enable everybody to start speaking with the river much more than we have been in the past. In doing this, This is the Birrarung Council vision statement that's on our website. We'll champion the interests of the river as one living and integrated natural entity, as reflected in both the community vision. So this legislation requires a 50-year community vision. So there is now a beautiful vision for the Yarra in 50 years that the community came together. There is also a statement from Wurundjeri Woiwurrung, which means the ancient spirit and law of the Yarra. And together, these documents embody an extraordinary future for the river and our relationship with it. The important thing about the legislation is that it says this community vision must also be the guide that drives all of the strategic plans, all of the implementation plans. Everything must work towards achieving this vision. So the vision itself has become a legislated outcome. In doing so, the Birrarung Council will walk together to care for the Birrarung. So we are comprised of Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. We've done a lot of work and thinking to think about how can we do this in a way that centres culture and language and tradition and spirituality, and in which we talk much more openly about this relationship with the river that we have and that we're trying to cultivate, and that respects the relationship that has been built over millennia by Wurundjeri Woiwurrung. Wurundjeri Woiwurrung have origin stories for the Birrarung. It has always known people since its birth. The river has been accompanied by people. People have been with it forever. So it is a river that has always known people, and they know it best. So the council is always thinking about how do we walk together more effectively so that the voices of the elders are amplified. We have a statement that guides us called our Walking Together statement. We also have a Walking Together action plan, which lays out things that we will do to ensure that tradition, culture, ceremony are part of the way that we operate. We have a new river management framework as part of the Birrarung legislation. So the legislation was passed back in 2017. That's the Willip-Jin Birrarung Moron Act. The community vision and Nan Naran Ba Naganan Tuan Birrarung, the Wurundjeri Ancient Spirit and Law, came out in 2018. Took another 4 years because the process was quite long-winded, but we now have Burned-Up Birrarung, Burned-Up Umaku, and this is the first 10-year strategic plan for the Birrarung. The Birrarung Council has a very specific role in relation to that 10-year plan. We must report to the minister every year on the implementation of that plan and how people are actually upholding the entire piece of legislation. The minister must table our report in Parliament within 7 sitting days. So it is a very public process by which we can directly advise the minister and directly speak to the public. So the minister can't edit our report, she simply must table it in Parliament. So the integrity function that we perform then is holding all of the, we call them responsible public entities. So this is local governments, it's Department of Transport, Department of, what are they called now? Energy, Environment and Climate Change. It's the water authorities, so it's Melbourne Water. It's everybody who has a role to play in keeping the river healthy or whose actions impinge on the river are now required to do things under that Yarra Strategic Plan and under the Yarra Protection Act. And it's the job of the Birrarung Council to tell the minister and the public every year how well they're doing at that. So we tabled our first report in Parliament at the start of this year. So we sent it off to the minister at the end of October last year in accordance with our legislation. But unfortunately, we then had an election. So it took a good couple of months before that was tabled in Parliament. But the outcome of that has been quite successful. It was a very, that report will also be on our website. It was a pretty high level report because the plan had only been in place for about 6 months. But the minister has picked up all of the things that we've identified as priorities for the next year and sent that out as a letter of expectations to all of those responsible public entities, saying the Birrarung Council has said you need to do this, and it's now my expectation that you will. So that was a nice demonstration of that integrity function of the council actually demonstrating an outcome. So is this bringing us then into a renewed relationship with the rivers of Melbourne? We have now seen a commitment with the waterways of the west of Melbourne. So the Yarra runs through the east. We've seen now a similar policy position come out in the west saying there will be new legislation to recognise all rivers in the state of Victoria as living entities. So that's underway right now. The department is developing up legislative proposals. What we can see very clearly are some new narratives emerging that guide our relationship with the river and reflect that relationship. We still very much have a narrative of what can we take from the river? What can the river do for us? So the river is providing a lot of services. As I said, it still supplies a significant portion of Melbourne's drinking water. It's a drainage area. So a lot of water, a lot of storm water, a lot of runoff ends up in the river. And it's one of the reasons why the lower reaches particularly are so sick right now. Sometimes raw sewage can end up in the river if there's a particularly high rainfall event. It also provides a lot of amenity services, right? You'll see a lot of people going walking, running, riding, taking their dogs down along the river. So as a green space and as a green corridor that connects large parts of Melbourne, it's an incredibly important resource. So the narrative about what can the river do for us, what can we take from the river, is still very much with us, but it's starting to be accompanied by different narratives. And this is the power of recognizing the river as a living entity. The community vision asked all of us to imagine, what do we want for the river? And the river now has a voice, the Birrarung Council, and its interests have a champion. And so the river is an active participant in achieving that voice. So we're asking, what do we want for the river? And how do we get there with the river? And that's a significant shift. The river becomes a partner, and we all walk together to create that better future that we outline in that community vision. So it doesn't necessarily immediately resolve those challenges that come from what we're extracting from the river, but it is starting to reshape the way we talk about the river, the way we interact with the river, and it's starting to repair the foundations of that relationship we have with the river. So to finish up, some takeaways here. Ooh, sorry, my phone just went off. Some takeaway messages for you is that law, I think, can repair our relationship with rivers, but we need to start by acknowledging the history. So in Australia and other settler colonial states, that means you have to centre the relationship between Indigenous peoples and the river, and you have to partner with them as well as with local communities in law reform processes. So that's the essential beginning point. We also have to integrate the changes to the legal status of rivers with water law. So it's not enough just to think we can change the legal status over here and not actually affect water law that is doing all the damage. Finally, I think we shouldn't be afraid of what can be termed mere symbolism, because symbolism is often how we change the relationship that we have with rivers. And it can be the beginnings of hope and the beginnings of significant change. What we're talking about is lifetime change, generational change. And we get there by changing the relationship, changing the language that we use to describe it. So on that, I will stop sharing and we can go into some questions.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Erin. I'm listening with great interest as to the processes that brought the Birrarung Council into being, given we have so many communities around Australia who are kind of desperate to protect local places more and will really have a go at rights of nature or, you know, connecting with Indigenous first laws, whatever might get the most interest and traction. So I've got a couple of questions from our folks in the audience, and forgive me, everyone, I will shorten the questions a little just for brevity of time. We have a question about legal personhood. The question is more about how it works. So corporations, isn't it specifically designed to make the corporation the legal person and protect the CEO? And in fact, you know, the legal personhood construct is one that is a very interesting one, as you mentioned, in common law, and it is problematic when we apply it to nature. Did you want to touch on a little bit, Erin, you know, your thinking about personhood?
Yeah, that's a good question because it goes to the heart of the challenge of applying legal personhood to rivers and to nature, and to even using the idea of legal personhood to radically upend our legal system. And partly it's because it's quite an individualist way of thinking. So it's not necessarily relational. It can be, we can push it in that direction, but the history of it is individualist. So that's a challenge. The other history, of course, as you point out here, with its specific beginnings with corporations, it was designed to separate risk and reward. So it was designed to enable shareholders to invest their money in a company, but to have the company be a separate legal entity to the shareholders, so that the company would take the risk. So if there was anything that went wrong, the company would get sued, or the company might have to, pay the bill, but the shareholders would not be on the hook for that. They would benefit from all of the profit that the company could generate, but they would not be actually personally fronting up and bearing the risks. So it's a profoundly problematic beginning. And I think it's one of the challenges for the rights of nature movement to really come to grips with that, and to think very carefully about what is the problem we're trying to solve, and is legal personhood the right legal tool to solve the specific problem that we actually have.
Thanks, Erin. And from Ayla's point of view, given like the Atrado River was recognised as having its own legal rights, and they articulated what they were specific to a river. If you're going to move in the direction of rights of nature, we would think that's a much better way to go than trying yet again to squish poor old Mother Nature into constructs that were made by people for people. And legal personhood popped up in the New Zealand situation for unique reasons and has triggered an entire movement and discussion and debate, but it's probably not the preferred way to try to recognise a living being. But thank you, Erin. Bryn has asked a question. While the water in a river is in a continual state of movement and transition through evaporation and rain and runoff, etc., the beds and banks are relatively permanent. Most current legislation treats the beds and banks as separate from the water in the river. How will river rights encompass all these elements of a river? And you touched on this in your talk, Erin. Did you want to elaborate a little bit on how things are now, what's going on with the rights stuff, and what might be possible?
Yeah, so again, this is a good question, because it does reflect the way that the law tends to isolate and separate out the elements of a river, rather than seeing it holistically and in its entirety. So a good example of how you can bring these elements together would be the Wanganui River in Aotearoa, New Zealand. So if you look at that legislation, I think it's section 12 that talks about the river as a living and indivisible whole from the mountains to the sea. So then we're talking source to sea, the entire catchment, all its metaphysical and physical elements. So it's a remarkably comprehensive definition of the entire catchment of the river, the mountains to the sea, the land and the water, the spiritual elements, the intangible elements, as well as the physical elements of the river. And without more, that would include the water. But there is that later section in the legislation, and forgive me, I can't remember which section it is, but that section explicitly says that it does not affect any of the existing rights to water in the river. So without that exclusion, the river would encompass that water. So there is a way of bringing it together. I think the challenge is mainly now for settler state lawyers to go, well, how do we build that bridge between legislation that recognises the river as a living entity, like the Te Awatupua Act, or like the Willipgin Birrarung Council Act, and actually hook it in to the water laws, the specific legislation that governs the use and control of water. So it's not impossible, but it does require more creative legal thinking and more joined up legal thinking than we've seen so far.
Thanks, Erin. And I'm just going to jump around the questions to group a couple together. Charlotte has asked, what mechanisms exist to hold decision makers to account when there are already laws to protect rivers? The Birrarung already has a Yarra Protection Act, strategic plan and planning controls, but bad stuff is still happening. And there's another couple of questions about changes to water law. Another one's asked, have these changes integrated with the Yarra River Protection Act? How do these fit together in practice? So I've sort of grouped the questions about the Yarra.
Yeah, okay. So I'll start with the kind of easy one. The Yarra River Protection Act is predominantly actually a land use piece of legislation. It says very little about the way that water is managed. It has almost no connection back into the Victorian Water Act. So that's the biggest blind spot at the moment confronting that piece of legislation. Having said that, it does connect and interact through the particular agencies that are playing a role. So the lead agency, the one that is responsible for the kind of overall push for the Yarra Strategic Plan implementation, the one that's working with all of those responsible public entities and pushing them and asking them to report every year on their own progress with that plan. That's Melbourne Water. So they have the catchment and land responsibilities in this area. They've got a healthy waterways strategy, and so that's connected into the reporting arrangements on the Birrarung. So there are connections into that water and waterway management space, but they're just not very strong and they're not particularly explicit or clear. So that's something I think that should be an area for targeted reform in the future, especially if Victoria is going to pass legislation to recognise all rivers as waterways, all waterways as living entities. Then part of that should actually be to tidy up some of these gaps in the Birrarung legislation. In terms of the mechanisms to hold decision makers to account, this is a really hard one and this is one of the questions that I think you've got to ask at the very beginning of this process. What kind of legal representation do we need for the river? So if you need to get the river into court so that damages to the river can actually be seen and understood by the law, and then use the court system to hold people to account for creating those damages, then you might need to think about legal personhood. And obviously we don't have that with the Birrarung at the moment. So the ability of the Birrarung Council to hold people to account is largely limited to what is the legislation set out for us all. So we've got Yarra protection principles in the legislation that people should be giving effect to. What does the Yarra Strategic Plan require us to do? And how much progress are we actually making against those things? So that's the role of the Birrarung Council. But there are myriad ways, and Charlotte will know this probably better than I will, in terms of the other levers that you can pull with authorities like the Environment Protection Authority. But yeah, bad stuff is still happening. A lot of it is happening, and these things come before the Birrarung Council, and we have a very constrained budget and a constrained opportunity to intervene in everything. So we're constantly trying to think what's driving a lot of these bad decisions. And ultimately, it's because decisions are still being made in isolated ways, rather than saying we are managing the river holistically as a living entity. And all of our decisions that we might previously have thought of as being business as usual actually need to be elevated and considered against the need to manage it holistically. So that is the driver for change that we continue to push as the Birrarung Council. And that, yeah, that's the kind of thing that at planning approvals, development stages, that's the sort of thing that you could make submissions on to say, no, like this particular decision should never be made, because when we see it holistically, we can see it as part of a pattern of degradation and loss along the river. But yeah, bad stuff is still happening. This is a long-term reform. And in Aotearoa, New Zealand, bad stuff is still happening to the Wanganui River. But Māori are using that generational shift to drive that change.
And perhaps we can just pause for a moment on the local and remember that, for example, in Ecuador, when it was passed in the constitution that the rights of nature would be recognised across the whole country, there was an early case, the Baikabamba River, which was like one of the world's most perfect cases declaring the rights of a river. But after that, there was a lot of toing and froing, a lot of cases were not won. But now we're seeing a greater uptake of people stepping up and saying, well, okay, the Constitution recognises the rights of this forest and that mangrove and that pocket and this pocket. So they're standing up, and because nature has a right, they can go into court, challenge unwanted developments. A really big mine was actually stopped, Los Cedros in the forests. So there have been ways through that structure to speak on behalf of these nature systems and stop certain things happening. So the Birrarung is, I think, a really important way of connecting people and really recognising Indigenous connection. Might not be able to do some of the stopping of things just yet, but perhaps down the track that's possible.
I think one of the hopeful things that we're seeing out of Ecuador, and particularly since 2018, because we've seen a much more active constitutional court creating constitutional rulings on this. And again, it comes because it's in their constitution. So that's enormously powerful. But since 2018, the Constitutional Court is articulating consistently a jurisprudence, a line of cases that say that environmental protection legislation might set this bar, and companies are saying, well, I'm meeting that. And the court's saying rights of nature requires more. So they're articulating the difference between existing environmental protection and the rights of nature in the Constitution and saying it raises the bar. And that's profound and that's important.
Yeah, and as you say, prior to 2017, 2018, those interpretations weren't as strong and many cases were being lost. Probably got time for one or two more comments or questions. I'll just group two together. Neil has asked, if a river can have a legal right, can the same right be extended to Western Port? And someone else asked about oceans. And the short answer is yes. All this stuff is just human laws made up, remember? And it really depends. And I'll let Erin answer more fully. But the bottom line is, as I mentioned in the beginning of today's session, rights are being recognised for systems all around the world. And there are moves for a couple of more countries to have constitutional recognition, which I can't wait to see happen. But Erin, what do you think? Ports, oceans and beyond?
Go for it is the short answer. Like genuinely, these things come from human imagination and human effort. Every single example around the world has come from the leadership of community groups, from Indigenous peoples, and it's advocacy that is driving this change. Even where it's come through a court decision, for instance, in some of the South Asian countries like Bangladesh, it has come from the advocacy of particular non-government groups. So if you have a relationship with a particular natural feature, whether it's a port, an estuary, a river, a wetland, a mountain, a forest, anything that you can articulate that relationship with, then there will be other people like you who also have that relationship. And you can use that as a lobbying point to drive reform. I think one thing we could learn from the experiences of countries like the US is to try and target that reform at the appropriate level of law. So we know that constitutional reform, for instance, can be enormously powerful, as it is in Ecuador. It's correspondingly enormously hard to achieve. So a lot of experimentation has happened at the local government level. And I know Ayla has been part of a lot of that work here in Australia. And I think if you target the right kind of reform at that local government level, that can drive significant change. What we can learn from the US is that local laws will not stand up if they are inconsistent with the laws of the state or the federation in the case of Australia. So we have to make sure that we're using those legal tools effectively. But again, you can drive change at almost any level for almost any natural entity.
And there's so much more we could talk about, because a lot of the work that the folks at the local level in the US do is profoundly strategic, because they're trying to highlight the fact that corporations can override community wishes. And that's actually part of the story they've been trying to reveal for a long time. So that's a whole nother conversation. There are a number of other questions. We won't have time for all of them today, but Erin speaks a great deal in lots of different places, and I'm sure if she's keen to answer any of your questions, you can get in touch with her. Someone has asked, is there anything going on in the Murray River space? Erin, did you want to talk about, there's been, poor old Murray-Darling is just in so much trouble. Did you want to talk about some of the work that you've been doing on I guess, consulting on some of these issues?
Look, the Murray-Darling space, it's immensely challenging. I think one of the interesting things that I've learned recently about the Murray-Darling and the people who live there is that from the outside, right, we see it as this enormous space, this interconnected river system of over 1 million square kilometres. And it is that. It is an interconnected river system, and we need to see it holistically. But for the people who live in it, most of them don't identify with living in the Murray-Darling Basin. So about 72% of people, the Murray-Darling Basin is not the thing that defines for them where they live or how they're interacting with the world around them. So the takeaway for me on that is that we need to think much more about the scale at which these kinds of decisions are being made. So if you work with First Nations in the Murray-Darling Basin, over 40 First Nations call the Murray-Darling Basin home. So their scale of engagement with that system and with that river is significantly small. It's much more human. The connections between people and place are much more easily understood at a smaller scale. Doesn't mean you need to lose sight of that bigger picture, and the entire thing does deserve our care and love as well. But I think the way into that conversation that has been so overlooked in all of the federal debates, I think particularly about water policy, and this is now going back to the 90s, have been to try and encourage the states to come together and manage this interactive, holistic system in that holistic way. But in doing so, you've managed to disconnect a lot of the people who live in the basin and who could be advocates for change and connection. So I think there's a real opportunity when we think about the rights of rivers and the river as a living entity to think about the scale at which that makes sense for us. So the entire Birrarung, the Yarra River, is about 230 kilometres long. That is a scale that can make sense to people just. It's such a different river at each part of its basin. When we think about the Murray-Darling, I think the challenge will be to not lose sight of that interconnection, but to target change at a scale that brings people into relations with that river.
Yeah, thanks, Erin. Some really interesting ideas going on in that part of the world. For those who are interested, 2 years ago, ALAR held a citizens' inquiry for the poor state of the Barker River, the Darling, not the Murray. And if anyone wants to have a look at the link, I've put that in there. And a number of communities have reached back to us, really interested in, and if you think about scale, the townships along the Barker River are particularly connected and have always been, obviously, but even in more modern times through their allocations and management of that river system. And there is interest in that space. There's also interest by some civil society groups in some parts of the Hawkesbury Nepean. And I mentioned some of these. Sorry, someone's jumped off their mute. Let me just manage that. There's interest in a number of different other places. We had assisted the Blue Mountain City Council to think about rights of nature differently and to bring that into their operations. And we're still kind of discussing with them what that can look like. So it's an open invitation. If any of you out there are interested in further conversations, please do get in touch with Ayla if you wish. Track down Erin if you want to also talk to her. I'll put in our main email address for Ayla. We are actively working with people, not so much because we're zealots about rights of nature. We're truly not. What we are interested in is ensuring that our system of life on this continent has its best chance to survive, thrive, and go onwards. So if we can explore ways with communities, as Erin said, to advocate for more relationship-based ways of caring for country and caring for water, then that's what we're interested in. But on that note, Erin, anything else you wanted to add before we wrap up? And I'm sorry we haven't got to everyone's questions, but it's always a fantastic discussion when we look at our beautiful rivers.
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful note to end on. I'm really, really happy to, if people would like to get in touch with me and talk about what they would like to do with their rivers, if there's anything that they can learn from the Birrarung Council, really happy to share any of the insights that we've learnt over the past 5 years. And I think for all of us, this begins with our relationship with the river. So that's your way into conversations with communities. Rivers are seen as tremendously valuable places by the people who go and visit them. And that's something that we all have in common, even if we disagree about many, many other things. So that is a starting point always for how we can better protect them, is to build on that relationship.
Yeah, lovely. And don't forget, there's also forests and wetlands and coastal zones and lots of other beautiful places. So we wish you all the very best with your love for the living world. And thank you so much, Erin. I know you're incredibly busy, so we're grateful for you to share your regular updates with us about river rights and river laws. And for someone who asked, yes, this has been recorded. It'll be up on the Ayla website probably by next week. So do come back and have a listen again. So thank you again, Erin. We'll look forward to hearing from you again one day soon. Thank you, everyone. See you soon.